Hi, Lucette. Thank you so
Hi.
much.
Oh,
So you are in LA and you're getting ready to go back to Australia, which
yes.
it's crazy times, so we're wishing you the best. But today I wanted to kind of speak a little bit more about, we're recording this for Earth Day, which I'm so excited about. And I wanted to speak to you specifically because your sort of Instagram and your ethos with the Wylde and sort of what you portray has always been to me such a fundamentally beautiful way of kind of existing in the world. And I really wanted to touch upon that today. So for those of our audience who might not know so much about you, would you just give us a brief kind of background about who you are and what you do, and also maybe just touching upon how nature and the environment has impacted your life as you've kind of evolved into the woman you are today?
Yeah, of course. Um, well, as you mentioned, I live in LA at the moment, but only for another week, and then I'm flying back to Australia. And I actually was born in Colorado, and so I lived there until I was 5 and grew up like in the mountains and skiing in the winters. And when I was 5, I moved to Australia, and at first I actually moved in with my nan who lived right next door to a nursery. So I think that kind of started my love of plants and nature and things from a young age, because we would go over into the nursery and my nan had this beautiful big backyard with all of these amazing plants that she was growing, and we'd turn over little rocks and there's like little millipedes and worms and things under there that I was just so fascinated by. But I lived in Australia until I was 19, and then I moved over to Bali for 5.5 years. And Bali it kind of encapsulated everything that I was always looking for in terms of the ideal lifestyle for me and the people that I wanted to be surrounded by and the culture that I was injected into. And at the time I had moved over there, I had become really sick with a parasite. And through that parasite journey, I realized how important it was to become vegan for health reasons. And the vegan aspect of those health reasons then led me down this really beautiful path of respecting a lot of the different elements within nature, including animals, and how we can better incorporate food into our lives, and how we can make sure that what we're doing within nature is actually very much harmonious with our bodies. And so, yeah, it was a really beautiful period of time, and I think that 5.5 years very much summarized who I am today in a lot of different ways. Especially growing up in Australia, I lived so close to the beach. We would go to the beach every single weekend. We were always going into national parks and camping and fishing and doing all of these things that, were heavily surrounded by nature. And then when I went to Bali, it was like that, but simplified even further, because the people there are very graceful and slow, and it inspired me in a lot of ways to slow down my own life.
Have you that, it's really interesting that you bring up that idea of slowing down, because I think right now, obviously, we're in a period of time when we've all been forced to do that. And it's incredible. And I think that what I am realizing more than ever is that in terms of sustainability, I don't actually know how you become a more sustainable person, run a more sustainable business, do anything sustainably without being slower. And I already consider myself quite a sustainable person, and REV obviously, as sustainable as a business could be, in my opinion. But this has taken it to another level, and I feel like there's this huge moment of sort of realizing that maybe the pace of life we were living was too fast for any sort of meaningful and ethical decisions to ever really happen. Like, would you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. I think, especially at the moment, it's been really interesting watching, because there is obviously a lot more plastic usage. People are using single-use gloves and hand sanitizer and plastic bags to cover a lot of things. So I think there has maybe been a little bit of a surge in terms of plastic usage. But in terms of what people are now doing in their own households is really, really remarkable. You know, a lot of people are being really specific about what they do with their food waste. So maybe people are not throwing away as much food before because, you know, we have this huge crisis of food wastage that's all going to landfills. And people are being quite resourceful now with their food. Maybe they're saving their vegetable scraps to put into a compost pile because they're building their own garden, or maybe they're saving them for a vegetable stock, or maybe they had some leftovers that they're like, okay, I can't go to the grocery store again for another week, so I can use these leftovers to make this new dish, and they're going to repurpose that. I see a lot of people using, and even I'm doing the same, you know, a friend of mine is also doing it, but, you know, saving onion skins and avocado seeds to do natural dyeing at home. These things are all methods that have been used for hundreds of years in terms of, you know, reusing and being self-sufficient and making sure that what you're doing is actually creating a slower impact. And even during this kind of a situation, people are still finding ways to be resourceful like that. It's so inspiring.
Yeah, it has been a really interesting time. And I wonder, you know, kind of going back upon your point as well with how you sort of felt like veganism and going into a more plant-based space also helped you reconnect with nature. And I think it's a really interesting time as well, because we are looking at the fact that, you know, this disease has come out of the really bad mistreatment of the way we're eating animals and consuming animals. And, you know, I'm not fully vegan, but I do try to be completely, you know, as plant-based as possible. Do you feel like this is a good time for people maybe to explore this idea of eating more vegetables, or looking more at the origins of meat if they'd like to continue eating meat? How had that journey into veganism sort of helped you with a little bit more respect for sort of the animals that we live with on earth?
I think the journey into veganism and just eating in general, it is so important to look at the origins of everything that we're eating. Um, sorry. And, you know, that's why everybody making their own gardens is so inspiring to me, because there's no middleman. It's just your garden, it's your food source. And I have friends who are hunters who actually, you know, have their own gardens, and they grow everything themselves, and then they only eat what meat they catch or what fish that they actually catch themselves. And that way they know that there's no one else involved, there's no antibiotics putting into it or anything like that. And so I think that if you do have access to something like that, that can be a really great alternative. You know, teach yourself how to fish, teach yourself how to go out and, you know, find your own meat if that's what you want to do, and then teach yourself ways that you can actually sustain having that, whether that's smoking it or drying it or freezing it or whatever it is. I think that we've gotten really, really far from, you know, that hunting and gathering nature that we actually come from, and that is very intuitive. And that's why a lot of people are starting to become very intuitive in building their own gardens and doing those things, because it is just second nature to them. So within the veganism aspect, you know, if it is something that people do want to start cutting out, I mean, we're not really going outside right now. So maybe when you're going into your grocery stores, start looking at where those meat sources are coming from, or those fish sources, and be like, okay, is this wild caught? Was it raised in a factory farm? Is this something that I really want to be supporting right now? As you know, I can actually be making these choices and cooking what it is that I want and learning more about this. And, you know, I think that even in terms of what we're doing with our dry goods is really, really important. I used to work at a really great store that was all about bulk foods, and you could go in, you'd get a big mason jar, and you fill up exactly what you need. So you can put in as much rice as you want or whatever it is. There's no plastic involved. You're just absolutely grabbing what you need. And the really cool thing about that is they have the origins of everything on the product. So this was sustainably grown in here, and this is organic, and this is what's in this, and this is the people. And you can then go and research those companies and find out, you know, who the farmers are, and see where their property is, and look at the conditions. And I think that is also something that is really interesting, that people aren't kind of paying attention to where their plant sources come from. We get a lot of imported fruits and vegetables because, maybe seasonally we don't grow certain things. But that's a whole nother topic, eating seasonally. I could go on.
I know, but it's a really important one. And I actually think in terms of, for people that are listening and might just think, okay, well, what would a key takeaway from this be? Would you say that eating seasonally, eating locally, would that be more important than eating organic and plant-based to you? Like, where would you almost, in terms of maybe an ethical stance, where would you say is a great starting point for people that maybe are just starting the journey of more sustainable eating?
Eating seasonally is very difficult. You have to know your region, and you have to know what foods actually grow in that region and what foods are native, um, or what foods grow easily at certain times of year. But I would definitely recommend to start with eating locally. And what you'll actually find is that most of the people who produce locally, depending on where you are, produce organically as well. So one of my favorite things to do is go to the farmers market, and a lot of farmers markets are still running right now. They are being very diligent about, who can come in at certain times like that. But on any normal day, my favorite thing to do every week on a Sunday is go to the farmers market and go and meet the farmers who actually grow the food, and they're selling it and they can tell you about it. And, they've got the certificates about being certified organic, and the atmosphere in a farmer's market is also really heartwarming. It gives you this really beautiful joy, and that's something that you can really bear witness to and feel in the energy, because you're walking into this place where everybody's there to support local businesses that are slow, that are small, and people that actually really care about what they're doing, as opposed to turning it into this big conglomerate that loses its integrity.
Yeah. Exactly. I love the farmers market. It's one of my favorite things to do too. But I wanted to just quickly go back to your idea of sort of, I feel like you have been able to create this lifestyle that reflects your values so much. I mean, you lived between Australia and Bali and LA, and now back to Australia, and these are all such beautiful sort of outdoorsy places. And I feel like sometimes people think that it's just impossible to change. You get bogged down with a job, or you start a family, or, and it just starts to seem like this thing that's really impossible to ever sort of change the way that you're doing things. And maybe not everyone's going to move to Bali. I know that sadly I can't, but, how would you say in general you've been able to kind of approach this idea of living a lifestyle that really reflects your values and makes you truly happy and nourished?
It's definitely not for everyone. I think it's really funny. I've always been that way. I remember being 14 and being like, Mum, I want to go to Morocco. And she's like, you can't, you're 14. Like, you're not, who's going to take you to Morocco? And I was like, but I want to go. And she was like, well, we need to talk about that maybe later.
Yeah.
And, around the same time, I was kind of like, well, now I want to move to Queensland. And that was, an hour flight away, and it was a 10-hour drive away. My mom was like, again, you're 14. And so that's, I think, something that I've always been drawn to. And I truly do believe it's a part of my Aquarius nature as well, because we are very free spirit. And like, if something kind of catches our attention or something that we want to do, we're like, okay, we're just going to go do that. And I can be very spontaneous in that way. But I do think that a lot of people are fearful, and I definitely do have certain fears about going and doing things like that. But whatever my end goal is, within knowing that that decision stands in integrity with what it is that I need to do with my life, I try and trust that guiding force. And, the move to Bali wasn't intentional in that way. I decided to go over there for work, and it was meant to be a 3-month stay. And 5.5 years later, I was still there. And I was like, well, I'm still here. And, I loved it so much that I just kept extending my stay, and then finding work, and I found my feet, and I found a great place, and I found this community. And I was like, this feels like home for right now. And so I'm going to let that be home for right now. And when that started to shift, I allowed that to shift, and I completely packed up and moved. I actually moved to Hawaii for about 8 months. And then, you know, the same kind of thing happened there. And Hawaii was very interesting because it was a lot slower than Bali. But the community aspect of it was really what grabbed me and brought me in. And I felt so drawn to being in the US during that period, but I knew that maybe Hawaii was a little bit too slow paced for what I wanted to do in terms of my business. And so I was like, all right, well, let's really shake things up. I know 2 people in LA, so let's go there. And that was a big one. That was, you know, quite lonely, but it's been such an amazing year and a half. And I'm definitely sad to leave, but I know that this next part of like going back to Australia is obviously the right thing to do, even though it is very daunting and scary as well. So yeah, I think people just need to jump if they feel it.
I know, it's so funny. I've had 3 big moves in my life, and I've never regretted a single one of them. And I think that's, you know, but it is interesting the fact that you picked up on this word of community so much, because I feel like right now we're almost like creating new communities. Like I'm seeing all of these things kind of emerge on Instagram and conversations happening. And, you know, I feel like that sense of togetherness and finding like-minded people from all over the world is so powerful. And I guess I just love to have you speak a little bit to what you sort of look for as traits of people that inspire you, and the sort of people that you know, that you follow and that you take guidance from. Because I feel like also with social media, there's so much out there. There's so much that we look at. There's so much reality TV. We could all fall into loads of different communities if we so chose. But what do you find as good ways to sort of connect and be led by the right people? Not be led, because obviously none of us should be led, but, you know, connect really and be inspired by the right sort of people.
Mm. I think it's hard. It really does depend on the person and who they get along with. You know, I am very introverted by nature, so uh, it's an interesting thing. Like I love being around people, but I can also spend, you know, days and days by myself. And, you know, I suffer from anxiety, but like this situation, just being alone hasn't been too bad for me. Whereas other people are probably like pulling their hair out knowing that they can't see their friends. And when I travel, it's interesting, you know, I try to spark up conversations with people when I'm in cafes and things like that. Or, you know, one of my favorite things is sitting down into a cafe and, you know, you might be working at your laptop and you kind of look around and there might be someone reading a book and they're the only person that's not on their phone. You know, there's people that are together in couples that are on their phones, not engaging with one another. And, you know, they're the kind of people that I feel like I'm naturally drawn to. It's not necessarily that I would go up to them and be like, hey, can I just interrupt you while you're in the middle of your nice like Zen time? Unless I felt very drawn to them. But I have been very, very lucky and very blessed to connect with a lot of different people through social media as well. And especially, you know, traveling and with the age of social media, we can see where people are in the world. And, you know, maybe, for example, when I was in Hawaii, I had already connected with a girl from Europe, and I'd messaged her and I was like, oh, I saw that you're in Hawaii as well. Like, I'd love to catch up with you. And she became one of my really, really close friends through that. And she introduced me to this network of people that she'd met through social media. And they've all become, you know, very important part of my life. And that was how I kind of expanded on my little Hawaii community. But one of the people that she'd met, I'd actually already met in Bali. So I think energetically, a lot of people are naturally drawn to one another as well. But it's important to find people who actually lift you up. I grew up in Australia, and part of the reason why I did decide to leave and did decide to like want to move away and things like that was because I didn't really find that where I grew up I had community. I was really bullied growing up, and so I was always looking for those people that had the same kind of interests as me, that artistic nature, the idea of being barefoot all the time, like not being an issue, and people that wanted to be outside in nature and not care about, what they were doing and whether they were going to go to college or university and those things. And that was just who I was naturally attracted to. And so Bali really nourished that for me, and in turn, so did Hawaii in a lot of different ways. And LA was a little bit trickier because, we are one of the most wealthy economies in the entire world. And a lot of people are very driven in terms of their careers here. And everyone is very nature focused, but, the focus is primarily on jobs and university and where you can go and how you can step up. And somehow even here I managed to find that really beautiful niche of people who just want to go hiking and go to the beach and have their hands in the earth and be building and doing all of these marvelous things. And I think that like attracts like in a lot of those ways. Once you actually know who you are and when you're set in yourself and your core, that energy is going to radiate out, and those people are actually going to be attracted to you as well, kind of like magnets.
Yeah, which is a lovely way of thinking about it. And I think, one of the things that I've been thinking about with community too, and I feel like you do this really in a really lovely way, is, you use your platform and your following to talk about things like growing vegetables, nourishing yourself from nature, respecting nature, and, without pointing the finger or placing blame on other people. I'm very interested in how you feel about, what this current situation and this pandemic is doing in terms of creating responsibility on people who have, I guess, large Instagram followings about, like for you, I feel like it's probably been quite easy to create content because you're not doing anything different. You're still, running around barefoot and picking jackfruits and all of these things, which is wonderful and beautiful. But how do you feel about, people with big influence on social media that maybe, are still plugging fast fashion brands and, really toxic makeup labels and stuff? Do you think that this is something that's gonna shift, or do you think it's getting stronger in this period?
I think it's going to shift. It is really difficult because, some of these people don't have the same upbringings that I do, and maybe they don't have the same values that I do. And so what they share is in integrity for them, which does make it really hard because, a lot of those people are probably going to receive some negative comments. And I've seen that on people's posts who have even only been posting flashbacks. Maybe they were at the beach and someone's commented, you should be social distancing and self-isolating and these things. And they're like, this photo was from last year on this period of time and things like that. And they're like, well, you shouldn't be posting it right now because you're giving people ideas and they could be going outside because they're inspired by you. And I'm kind of on the edge about that because some countries I do know are very strict right now in terms of not letting people go outside at all. Like, you're not allowed to go outside to exercise, you exercise in your apartment. But other countries do have other laws put in place to allow people to still get fresh air, which is vital to human existence. So it's really tricky. I think that, the sad thing is that I'm seeing a lot of smaller brands and a lot of slow fashion brands that are really struggling during this period to keep their heads above water, mine included, putting discounts on everything and trying to make money and get some kind of profit coming in and some kind of revenue. And then you see these fast fashion brands who are donating a lot of money, which is so amazing. And I can't disregard that whatsoever. But I do wish that there was, some kind of effort to put a slower approach on their products because they are still, sending a lot of garments out. They do have that capital. They're sending people out to do photo shoots now in their house, which is amazing because I still want creatives to be getting work. But I do hope that, those brands do start to fall into a more integral place in terms of what it is that they're putting out there. As at the moment, realistically, a lot of people aren't buying clothing because, where are we going? So we don't need to be buying a new outfit to sit around in our house, or maybe we're buying, a new kettle or something like that because we realize that our old one we weren't using it that much, but now we are. And so we need that. And so I think that the focus is shifting globally. It's very evident, away from fast fashion, simply because people don't need clothing that much right now. I think that the focus is shifting more towards lifestyle goods. And I think that it's shifting to more sustainable things and things that can actually be very useful for us in our day-to-day life. And I think that, depending on how long this goes on for, it could very much kind of slow down and hone back the fast fashion brands as well from what their initial marketing strategies have always been to becoming more streamlined and efficient and sustainable in some ways, and probably not all, but hopefully in the ways that count. And I do hope within that as well, people will start to see that the effects that fast fashion companies are having on the world in terms of their, climate change issues will make people start to look at more sustainably responsible companies and put their money towards those companies existing, because they're local companies and they're probably the ones that we want to be supporting, just like our fruit and vegetables and farmers market people.
Yeah, it is really interesting, because I feel like what COVID-19 has done with regard to climate change is shown us that it is possible to be, as we were saying a little bit earlier, for humankind to be brought to our knees. We're not, we're not above it. And with all of our technology and all of our wisdom and all of our dominance of the earth, we've still been, completely at the mercy of something that we are really struggling to figure out. And I feel like more than ever now, I'm like, wow, climate change could really be awful, because with COVID-19, hopefully we'll get a vaccine. We're going to work so hard to overcome this. But, once we get to a certain point with climate change, that's it done, in terms of the world that we've known. And I think now we can start to see that we're not immune from that happening. We're not completely able to stop. So with that being said, I mean, how are you thinking about your life, and maybe anything that you would want to do differently or see differently in the world on the other side of this? I think people are really just trying to think about, like we were talking about this also, I'm not taking up any new hobbies or doing anything crazy, but I am thinking about, like, I've really enjoyed the quietness. I've enjoyed the slow pace. I've enjoyed running my company at a slower pace. And that's something I do want to take forward. So is there anything that you've thought about that you're like, this is something I could really see being beneficial to me and to the greater public in the future?
It was very interesting because, as I said, I've always grown up in nature, and I've always had this connection with like growing my own plants and things like that. And initially when I moved to LA, I was living in this beautiful house in the canyon, and I had started my own composting bin, and I was looking at building cedar raised beds to have a vegetable garden and things like that, because the deck was all concrete. And I unfortunately had to move out of that house, and now I'm living in a smaller apartment. And when the pandemic actually started and a lot of stuff started to get locked down, I had already, prior to that, traveled to Hawaii. And so I was in Hawaii on the land, picking jackfruits and oranges from the tree on my friend's property. And I was like, why do I live in a city where I don't have a garden? Why do I not have access to those things that are really important to me? And, I had kind of made a deal with myself that I was going to come to LA and put in some hard work and do all of these things. And, on the flip side of that, leaving is quite sad, because I didn't get to do all of these things that I want, even though right now we can't do any of them. So there's no point of me being here. But it really made me reflect and reassess what it is that are the values in my own life and what it is that I want. So like, if coming back to LA is an option for me in the future, then I should probably look at living somewhere where I have a garden. I should look at somewhere where I can have my own fruit trees and have my own vegetables growing and things like that. And going back to Australia now, I'm really excited to actually realign myself with my values, which are being, and it's very much built into the Wylde, the ethos of things coming from the earth and being for the earth, and it is something that is so important to me, and I'm not sure how I quite lost track of that for the last little period of time. But I think personally, coming off the backside of this, it's made me realign with those values and realize what it is that is just innately so me and is so important to me, and how I want to live my life and how I want my future to be. Like, I can't imagine myself living in a big city for the rest of my life. I think I would not suffer, but I think I would really struggle with that kind of lifestyle. And some people don't like living in nature. Some people love living in New York and they really thrive off that energy, and that's totally okay. And there might be some people that are in nature right now that are like, I don't want to live in this small little town anymore, and I really want to move out to this big city and be part of that community and be on the level where I can be part of this groundbreaking action. Whereas a lot of people are actually shifting to a slower perspective. And that's very much what I've realized through this, especially being in Hawaii, having all of that beautiful abundance around me. When I knew I had to come back to LA, I was like, okay, this is kind of scary. Now I'm going to have to go and buy all of this food and stockpile for, 2 weeks so that I can self-isolate and just have what I need, and I don't need to go outside and things like that. And within climate change, it's always been something that I've thought about. I never thought it would happen in terms of, a virus stopping everyone and putting everyone in their place. But we witnessed climate change very heavily impacting Australia just over the summer period, where these huge fires were plaguing the entire country, and, people were fleeing from their homes. And I was watching this from afar, devastated, because this is a place that I grew up and love, and it is one of the richest sources of nature that we have. And watching that was kind of like the precedent for what could be to come if we don't act quickly and we don't slow down and we don't change our way of life, because we have been very greedy. I mean, even I, as doing as best that I can, know that some of my actions have been greedy in terms of nature in the past, and I want to change those. And we can only do as we can do and what we can afford to do, and the things that, we can learn. And we're still always learning, and we're still always adapting and changing in different ways. And I think that people are starting to recognize that and making those slow shifts and those slow changes to where they need to go once this is all settled down.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, it's in that case, you do think of it as almost being not an exciting time, but it's a time for growth, which is awesome. So going into the Wylde, because we haven't even touched upon it yet. So we're coming up to Fashion Revolution Week, and I feel like a few years on from what's happened at Rana Plaza and this real noise about slowing down fashion, more equitable pay, all the things that we know should be the case in fashion still very much are not. So it's really nice to speak to a woman who started a fashion brand who's based so much on her workers and a slow way of doing things and respect for nature. So can you tell us a little bit about the Wylde and its conception, and sort of how you came to create this really beautiful, natural, respectful clothing line?
Yeah, definitely. When I got my parasite, I was going and seeing naturopaths and all kinds of different holistic doctors that were helping me and guiding me on this journey. And my skin had started breaking out really badly, and I was pretty sick. But my skin was the one noticeable thing that people were really associating with what was obviously going in, what was going on internally for me. And through different guidance from naturopaths and holistic doctors and acupuncturists and all of these people that I was seeing were all telling me to stop, putting chemicals on my skin. They were telling me to stop eating meat and things like that. And so that's when my journey started transitioning into veganism. And obviously through that period, I was like, okay, well, chemicals, pesticides, so I'm going to eat organic as well. And I started noticing that not only on my face was I getting acne, but I would get it on my arms, and I was getting it on my chest and my back and my legs. And I was thinking about it. And sometimes it was a rash. I was like, what is it that's creating this all over my skin? Because surely this can't only be internal. Our skin is the largest organ of our body. And it kind of hit me that there was this huge organ that was wearing all of this chemical all the time through clothing. And I was sitting there and I was looking up brands and I was trying to find companies that were doing organic clothing or natural fibers or natural dyeing that was the kind of pieces that I actually wanted to wear. And I wasn't finding it. And I was sitting back just going, okay, then I'm in Bali. I know how to sew. I grew up sewing. My mom taught me all of these different things. So I'm going to go to some tailors and I'm going to get some clothes made and I'm going to go get the fabric myself and I'm going to do this. And I started getting some clothes made and I had friends being like, this is amazing. And we really, really love this. And at the time I had already kind of conceptualized the Wylde, but it wasn't a clothing brand. The Wylde actually launched with Home Goods, and we sold, I sold straw kits from bamboo straws so that we weren't putting, plastic straws into the environment anymore. And we were selling different wooden bowls that were repurposed from teak root. So it's called like burl wood. And when you look at the wood, it has all these beautiful, rich, unique grains all through it. And it's really, really beautiful. It almost has this iridescent nature when you put it in the sun. And I was making those so that these stumps weren't going to go to waste because they were going to go to landfill, and they were all like these antique, beautiful pieces of wood that could be carved into something really magnificent. And as the clothing started transitioning through my personal life and people started gaining more interest into it, I was like, okay, this is obviously something that other people want to see as well. And so at the time, I wasn't actually able to find any natural dyers. And so my entire first line was released only in white, because then I could assure that the fabric wasn't bleached. I could assure that it hadn't been dyed with any chemicals or anything like that. And so it was a completely undyed, raw cotton that was used in that collection. And then I was lucky to find a really amazing natural dyer in Bali who only works with plants, and all of their runoff water goes back into the plants that are grown. So any of the dye that actually runs off the product, because there is a lot of water runoff in dyeing, goes back into the plants in the surrounding areas, and the soil actually filters out all of the color particles, which aren't toxic because they're made from, things like indigo and mango leaf. And it was so important for me to find somewhere that, we've got documentaries like River Runs Blue, where we can see these huge effects that even the dyeing industry has on the environment, where we look at this entire river that is blue, or maybe it's red because of the pollution that's coming off of these dye houses in India. And it's really, really terrifying to see stuff like that and realize that the little guys that are trying to do the right thing might not be getting noticed because their price points are higher. But, and it's one of the questions that I get often is, why is your price point so high? And it's like, well, I actually pay my workers really fairly, and I make sure that everything's made with integrity. And I don't have, these huge factories. I have this very tiny little family run factory that a friend had actually helped me find a tailor, and he pulled together a team that were then able to become my factory. And it was a really, really beautiful and organic way of coming together. But, we have 5 to 6 staff, and at any one time, there might be 3 of them working, and then they will do different shifts and things like that, because in Bali, everyone is very built on their family, and all of the families live together. And there might be 2 people in the family that actually support, 13 to 15 different people, depending on the size of the family. And those 1 to 2 people that have jobs, their minimum wage is, usually about $200 a month, which is not very much. And it doesn't really give you much wriggle room to actually support, a family of over 10 people. So I was kind of looking at that and figuring out what it was that my staff would really need to support themselves and actually try and get ahead in life and run this factory and have a place that was clean for them to work. And in supporting them, obviously the margins of what I'm able to charge do go up. And I think that if you go in anywhere and let's say you go into Target and you buy a shirt and the shirt's $10, who got paid to make that $10 shirt, and who got paid to transport that fabric, and who got paid to make that fabric, and where did that fabric come from? And it's like, how can we justify that $10 as being enough for this piece of clothing? You know, there was so many steps involved, and there were so many people that were seen in the process of this garment being made before it got to you. So how can we justify that $10? It becomes very difficult, because I understand as well that not everybody is in the same financial position to afford these items. But I do think that once more companies are able to become more sustainable, it will actually be able to level out some of the pricing so that people are able to afford it. And I think within consumerism as well, it becomes very tricky, because we are sold this idea that we need more. And this idea that we need more makes people want to continually have new items all the time and have these things that may be on trend. And one of the things that is really big for me with the Wylde is that we don't have these seasonal timelines, which, much to wholesalers, annoyance, because they're used to purchasing maybe it's summer and maybe a winter collection, or maybe they're used to purchasing, quite a few different times through the year, different collections. I very much try and steer away from that, because I think it's very important that we're not always producing all of these new items. And so, the kimono that I'm wearing, for instance, is from my very first collection. It was the very first piece that I made for the Wylde and for myself, because I love kimonos. I just think they're so versatile in that way. And this kimono is actually my very first sample. It has my very first old tag on it, and it's kind of a bit short, and the sleeves are a little bit different. And that means I've had this piece for 3.5 years, probably even longer actually. And I think that a lot of people aren't looking at fashion in terms of its longevity. They're looking at it as fast, which is what we know of fashion, and is, a big topic within the fashion industry. And if we start to slow down our fashion consumption, we can actually afford to support and purchase, an item that might be $200 instead of purchasing 20 items that are $10, that aren't going to last, that might last us 6 months to a year, as opposed to lasting us 5 to 10 years. And, I started also putting onto the website the cost per wear in our description. So if someone purchases something and they wear it 5 times, this is how much it's costed per wear. And if you have that for 10 years and you wear it over 100 times, it really eventually starts to become this amazing purchase. You're buying something that is going to last, that's going to have that longevity, and that isn't stuck in a seasonal timeline or a specific trend. And I think that aspect of fashion is also really important, and that's part of why my designs are so simple, and why I try and keep these pieces to be on a rotation, so that I'm not losing those pieces, because they are bestsellers for a reason. People do really love them. And I do have customers that will buy multiple of the same design in different colors, because it has become a staple in their wardrobe, because it is so easy for them to wear. And I think, I don't know if I kind of maybe got off topic, but
no, I feel like all of that is perfect. And I think, as speaking as a retailer, I love that the Wylde is just a culmination of the same styles sort of over and over again. And we do sell it. We've been how long have you guys been with us? A year and a half or something? And it,
yeah.
And I feel like we've literally, we've sell that Mom Earth kimono just over and over again. And it's a beautiful piece. And I feel like it's, it's a really interesting time in terms of asking people to slow down and consider, could you just buy 1 pair of trousers instead of 6? And actually that would end up, I love the cost per wear idea, because I think that's so exactly what we need to reframe our mindsets to think is, all right, I'm going to have to save up a little bit more, or this is going to be more upfront, but in the long run, it's something that I'm going to wear every day or every other day, and I love it. And I do think right now, do you think that, so we're obviously also starting, you and I, to work on a pre-order, which I really love the idea about. So can you explain maybe to the audience just sort of how a pre-order system works and why that's so great for production, for your workers, for sort of just keeping things really streamlined, and also maybe for waste as well?
In terms of pre-order, so at the moment, the reason I decided to do pre-order was because we were working on bringing out some new pieces that weren't necessarily entirely different, but I had some really cool ideas in mind that I wanted to bring to the table that were going to need new sampling and new patterns and things like that. And because we do have a very specific system in place at the moment worldwide, my staff were kind of on the border of not making any new patterns and just sticking with garments that they've already made, because they didn't want to have too many people in the factory all at once. And it is a small and family run factory, but we don't want to be pulling people away from their families for too long, and we don't want people to be getting exposed to things that they don't need to be. So at the moment, the pre-order system was what worked best to ensure that any items that were sold out, that because we have so many items that have been sold out that we decided not to restock, but there was still a lot of demand for. And so we made a decision to bring back items that had sold out so that people could actually just order what they needed. And then that would also save us, because as I mentioned before, a lot of people aren't really shopping for fashion at the moment. And it's not just in my experience, but from a lot of friends who own brands as well. That has kind of been the general feedback. And I was trying to think about the best way to still support our workers in a time where we're not making very much money, so that they can still have an income. And it hit me that the pre-order idea would be a really great way, so that people can order what they need. I can place the order with my factory, and then my factory can produce it and we'll ship it straight to the customer from then. It also takes out a lot of the middlemen. So the garment's not actually going to be traveling to Australia and then getting packed by us. It's going to stay in the location that it was made and then be shipped from Bali to the consumer. I know in your case it's different. We're going to ship them to you to save on the shipping, yeah. But it just did feel like the best way for me to be able to support the factory right now, especially because they were like, we just don't also really have the manpower right now to be placing huge orders. And within not being able to place these huge orders, I was like, okay, so I can't, purchase however many kimonos, like 50 to 100 kimonos right now. How about if I send you a list and I can send you the pieces that people are actually wanting to purchase? And within that, there's a 6 to 8 week lead time that people will need to wait. But people have been purchasing, which is really wonderful. And I think, everyone is happy to wait at the moment. We all know that everyone's slowed down. We can understand that there is something happening globally. And I think that it's kind of pulled people back from this idea that everything is so that instant gratification. We've gotten very used to it, especially in the USA with Amazon. We've got 1 day shipping, but these smaller companies are not Amazon, and that does put a lot of financial strain and pressure onto people. And it also creates unrealistic expectations as to what shipping companies can bring into play. And the pre-order idea had sparked simply because we usually do pre-order for our collections when we do release things. It helps out smaller businesses who maybe don't have a huge amount of capital to just go and purchase a lot of stock. And within that, we will have, the certain amount of stock that we know we're going to sell. And then once we've figured out how that collection does sell, then we can reorder things that, people actually want. So with our, I think it was 2 collections ago, we released a pair of pants that was an ode to all the women that I cared about in my life. And I am one of them. So I named a pair of pants after myself. And they sold really, really well. And it was great to see, because I was like, okay, these pants sold out in the first 3 days on pre-order. And, my pre-order limits are 30 to 50 units. And if that can sell out, I was like, okay, this is really, really great. So now I know I can put in another order for those pants, because they're probably going to sell. And I do think that really helps in terms of waste. Right now, it's helping in terms of waste because I'm not making all of these garments that are maybe then going to sit in a warehouse for an extended period of time waiting to be purchased. We don't know when. And it ensures that my factory is just making what's needed for the customers that need it. In terms of pre-order, you can release pre-orders where people are purchasing and then it only goes to a limit. So you might only have 10 pieces available. And once those are sold out, it's exclusive to those 10 pieces. And that's all that the customer can purchase. And I think that in terms of that as well, it really stops companies from, if you do take that method on board, or you do have a strict guideline like that within your business, it can stop companies from over purchasing stock and overproducing stock that may go into waste or landfill, or may need to be, put into donation centers and things like that, which are already completely filled to the brim with secondhand clothing. And, we do have a lot of knowledge about fast fashion companies that, and high-end fashion companies as well, that once the season is over, if the garments haven't sold, that they burn everything, which is just disgusting to me. I can't believe that part of things, but
it's insane.
yeah.
And I feel like, and now we're seeing all these huge companies canceling orders and production, and hundreds of thousands of people are now without work. And I think it's really important to have these sort of conversations, because it shows that, actually, it seems to me like the bigger companies could learn a thing or two from the smaller companies. And I really, really hope that this is one of the lessons that comes out of this time. And something else that I actually wanted to ask really quickly was, with plant dyeing, we have a lot of people really interested in natural dyes at REV, and that makes me so happy, because it's not something I've undertaken myself, even though I've realized, because I've started cooking with fresh turmeric, and I spilt some on a shirt, and I was like, oh my God, this really, really works, because I can't get it out now. So is really like plant dyeing things, is that something that could ever be taken to a bigger level or really expanded? Or is that something that's really only ever going to be applicable to small brands that, have the time, the inclination to do things by hand, and probably just because of, I would assume, the time and the cost, it might be prohibitive for bigger brands? Or do you think that's something that's scalable?
I think it can be scalable, definitely. You do have to know what you're doing. The reason that chemical dyes are so easy to work with is because they have a lot of chemicals in them that very quickly bind to the garments, and those binds stay for a very extended period amount of time. If you put that out in the sun, it might fade a little bit, but generally it doesn't fade very much. Whereas with plant dyeing, it is natural matter, so it is affected by elements. We have some customers who don't really maybe follow the natural dye instructions, and then they might get a little bit frustrated because maybe their garment was exposed to direct sunlight and then there was a sun leak or something on the garment, or maybe they washed it a couple of times with some bleach and the garment leached out the color. I think it can be scalable as long as customers know how to care for the garments, and that kind of does come down to the reason why I believe that a lot of retailers don't produce with natural dyes, because there are definitely some discrepancies that will come up. And I personally really love those discrepancies. I think that the way that natural dye actually permeates over time, and the way that it changes, and the way that it morphs and takes on its own really beautiful nature, is what makes natural dye so special. But I do think that we've been very conditioned to buy a garment and think that it's going to last that way forever because it's made synthetically and chemically. And yeah, I really wish that people would understand natural dye a little bit more, but I do think that it's coming. You know, I personally did some natural dye stories the other day because I don't have access to send things to my natural dye house right now, though they are still dyeing. I'm not shipping anything to them or getting new things for myself made. And I have done a lot of natural dye workshops. So I was thinking about it and I was like, I'm just going to do this at home. So I dyed some bed sheets with turmeric, and turmeric, just to clarify, will wash out. It will come out.
Thank God.
So it's not the most color fast, and color fast means fast is like how well it binds to the garment and the fabric, but it does wash out over time. So, you know, within ancient India, they've used turmeric for a very long time to dye their garments. And I think that they understand medicinally as well, as I touched base on before, what, you know, the fabric that we wear and the dye that we have on our garments can do to our skin. And if you're wearing something that's covered with turmeric, we all know that it's anti-inflammatory and it has all of these amazing healing properties. And so, you know, in India, wearing that on your skin, you understand the benefits of not just the dye for the earth, but you understand the benefits of the dye for the wearer. And once you dive into this rabbit hole, it kind of opens up this whole beautiful space within the natural dye realm. And the other day I dyed this kimono with indigo at home, which is quite time consuming, but indigo is a natural dye as well. It comes from plants, and it's something that I'm going to try and get my dye house to do at the moment, if they can, for pre-order as well. But I think that people can take that on at home. They can start dyeing at home. Maybe they purchase something and they think this would be really great in that color and it's not available, but that's okay because I can dye it myself. And, you know, we can take that on as the wearer to be part of something that just comes naturally to us. We might have a really favorite shirt that gets a little bit old and maybe it has a couple of turmeric stains on it. So we pop it into a dye bath that's filled with turmeric to create a new garment that then can have another life cycle. And for retailers, I don't necessarily know how they, like larger retailers, I don't necessarily know how they can expand on that, because it would become probably quite a bit of work with their customer service team, because not everyone, as I said, understands the care of natural dye. But it's all about education and understanding that, you know, if you use a bleach on a natural dye and even on a regular dye, it is going to strip the color. So that then comes back down to what we can do sustainably for, you know, our washing. It's sitting right in front of me and I really want to grab it, but
You should grab it.
this is like what I use to do my washing with. It's a pH neutral washing pod. And so it has little pellets in it. And this pod, you know, the pellets I've had in there for almost a year. And this pod cost, I think, around $60, and it came with 720 wash cycles worth of detergent. And when I did the cost of that, I was kind of thinking about it and going, all right, well, however many times I've purchased a bottle of washing detergent, you know, then I have this plastic bottle that I have to get rid of, and then I have to buy another one, and maybe that's, you know, $15 to $20 to $30. I bought this once, and it's called an eco egg. It's really amazing. I didn't mean to plug this, but here I am.
Plug away. I'll link it in the editorial so people can get it.
But I was recommended that by a friend, and I was like, wow, this is actually really, really amazing. And knowing that there's no harsh chemicals in that, I've used it with all of my natural dyes. None of the dyes have stripped. It doesn't have any scents in it or anything like that. So it's not, you know, rubbing scents off onto my skin, and it is quite hypoallergenic. I think if we can understand and inform ourselves better in terms of how we wash our garments as well, then it can completely change the life cycle of our clothing, because a lot of people are using, you know, they're drying all of their clothes, which is deteriorating the fabric, and maybe they're washing their clothes on a hot cycle instead of a cold cycle when it should be cold, but they just don't know any better and they haven't been informed of what the proper methods of dyeing, a certain textile is. Like, what should we do to dry silk? How should we, line dry this properly? Should this be laid flat to dry? All of those things can really have a massive difference on the life cycle of the garment, not just the dye.
Yeah. And what is really interesting I've found is, over the past 5 years of running REV, I have bought so much less, but I've spent more, on the individual items. But I have realized that also when you spend more money on items, you really do want to care for them. There's I remember when I was a teenager growing up in America, you just didn't care if a $10 t-shirt from the Gap got ruined because you just went and bought another one. Whereas now I would never look at any of my clothes and not think, I need to line dry them. I need to wash them by hand. I need to put them on a gentle cycle. I need to make sure I'm using eco-friendly detergents. Now probably an eco egg because I'm going to go buy one. So I think that's a huge part of it too. And I love that about educating people, or educating yourselves about how to really take care of your clothes. I think I read something like 30% of the carbon footprint of our clothing is the aftercare. It's what you do with it after you purchase it. This is really important. But anyway, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, Lucette. So I do want to just end with, going back to this idea of it being Earth Day. What would you say are just 3 really easy takeaways for people who've kind of listened to our conversation to maybe just be a little bit more conscientious or gentle to the earth at this time? Do you have some quick, good ideas that either you use or you would suggest that maybe people could follow at this moment?
I would definitely recommend for people to start keeping their vegetable scraps and things that, there is this very specific nature to composting and the way that you can do it. But if you do have a garden, I would recommend to start, you could buy a little bucket, or maybe you've got a little bucket at home or a bowl that you can put all your vegetable scraps in. You could keep some of those for natural dyeing, or you could keep some of them in the freezer. And then once you've got a nice pile of them, you can turn them into a vegetable stock. And anything that comes from citrus, you can actually store inside a jar in the freezer as well. And once you've got a full jar of that, you can fill it up with vinegar and make your own cleaning solution at home. And that one's a good one. That one I really love doing. And then any of those scraps that, or maybe you don't want to save any of them and reuse them, but you could save those scraps and create a compost pile if you do have a garden. Because that compost pile is actually really nutrient dense. It's going to be amazing for the soil. Worms are going to love that. It's going to create a really nice, nutritious environment for a garden to grow in the future, even if you're not planning on doing it right now. So that would definitely be one. I think it's really, really awesome that people are probably not going out and eating as much. So, there probably are people still doing a lot of takeaway, which, as we know, comes in plastic, but people are generally cooking at home right now. So another cool thing that you could do is start looking at the ways that you're storing your food. I think that beeswax wraps are really, really great. I love beeswax wraps. You can use them instead of saran wrap or cling wrap, whatever you call it. I haven't used saran wrap in years. I haven't used any aluminum foil or anything like that. Aluminum foil. People always pull me up on that, aluminium.
I know, same. Well, over here I get it from saying aluminum, so I get it. But yeah, I have these wraps as well, and they are a game changer. Really, fantastic.
So yeah, the food storage is a great way to start, minimizing the waste within your household. If you have any peanut butter jars, you can keep those once they're empty and start using them to store grains or seeds or nuts and things like that. That's a great one, because we probably all have jars that we don't realize we're just consciously, maybe not consciously, disposing of, but I hope that we're all recycling our jars. And for people that are perhaps getting boxes of things that are being shipped to them, you can actually keep those boxes and use them for other things, whether you store them, flat pack them somewhere and save them for a later date, or maybe you store them, in your storage to use next time you move house or something like that. I think that, we're very used to having all of these things in our life, but very used to just putting them in the trash or throwing them away. And I think we can be making all the very small, changes within our whole house right now. So those would probably be some of the takeaways.
Those are great. Well, thank you so much, Lucette, and good luck with the move. And we can't wait to follow your new adventure in Australia, and stay really well.
Thank you. And I'll speak to you soon.
Yes. All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye.